It is 1353. The worst is over. Probably. Maybe. You're standing in a village in northern France, or what remains of a village in northern France, which is approximately 60% of what was there 4 years ago. The houses are still standing, most of them. The fields are still there. The church is still there, though the priest is not, because the priest died in the autumn of 1349, along with approximately a third of the village's population. And the replacement priest hasn't arrived yet. And honestly, nobody is entirely sure who is supposed to send a replacement priest at this particular moment in time, because the bishop's office has also had some significant staffing issues. The specific word for what has just happened does not yet exist. The term Black Death won't be coined until the 16th century, and the people who have just lived through it describe it in various ways. The Great Mortality, the Great Pestilence, the Plague, using the specific vocabulary of people who have experienced something for which the existing vocabulary is genuinely inadequate. What they know is this: somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population of Europe died in approximately 4 years. In some areas, it was more. In some cities, Florence, Hamburg, parts of England's east coast, the mortality was closer to 60 or 70%. The mathematics are staggering in a way that statistics usually aren't. In 1347, Europe had approximately 75 million people. By 1353, it had approximately 50 million. 25 million people were gone. Not immigrated, not relocated. Gone in the specific comprehensive way of the dead. And now it is 1353, and the plague has retreated, not permanently, as the subsequent centuries would make clear, but for now it has pulled back, and the survivors are standing in their depleted villages and their half-empty cities and their farms where the livestock are still in the field because there aren't enough people left to manage them properly, and they are trying to figure out what happens next. What happens next is the subject of this script, and the answer is stranger, more consequential, and more fascinating than the conventional narrative of the Black Death, which tends to stop at the dying and not get to the living, suggests. Because what happened after the Black Death ended was not simply recovery, it was transformation. The Europe that emerged from the Black Death was a different Europe from the one that entered it. Economically different, socially different, politically different, psychologically different. The specific changes that the massive mortality produced rippled through every dimension of medieval life and produced consequences that the people of 1353 could not have anticipated, and that we are still, in some respects, living with. The peasants got better wages. The church lost authority. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Art took a turn for the dark and the beautiful simultaneously. The flagellants walked through the streets whipping themselves. The Jews were blamed and massacred. The universities lost half their faculty and somehow produced better medicine 20 years later than they had before. The aristocracy discovered that the feudal system was cracking at the foundation and that they couldn't fix it. All of this is what happened after the Black Death ended. Let's talk about it. Chapter 1. The Arithmetic of Catastrophe. What the mortality numbers actually meant for the survivors. You are alive. This is, in 1353, a more significant statement than it sounds. Not philosophically significant in the specific way of the contemplative tradition. Existentially significant in the specific way of the person who has watched a third of the people they knew die in the past 4 years, and who is now processing what their continued existence actually means in a world that has been permanently altered by the scale of the mortality. The first thing it means is labor. You, the survivor, are now doing the work of approximately 1.5 people, because the specific arithmetic of the mortality is that the workload hasn't declined in proportion to the workforce. The fields still need to be plowed, the livestock still need to be tended, the bread still needs to be baked, the wool still needs to be spun and woven, the trades still need to be practiced. The work is there. The workers are not, at least not in the numbers that existed before the plague. This arithmetic, the mismatch between the surviving labor supply and the surviving labor demand, was the single most important economic fact of the post-plague world, and its consequences ramified through every aspect of the medieval economy with the unstoppable logic of the supply and demand relationship that the medieval world understood empirically, if not theoretically. The specific numbers, region by region, tell the story in their variation as much as in their averages. England lost approximately 40 to 50% of its population. Florence, the richest city in Europe, lost approximately 60%, from 100,000 inhabitants to perhaps 40,000 in the plague years. Paris lost approximately 40%. Germany was hit unevenly, with some regions losing 60% and others losing 20%. The specific patterns of trade routes and population density, and the specific timing of the plague's passage through each location, producing the regional variation that the aggregate numbers obscure. The rural mortality was significant but varied from the urban mortality in ways that matter for understanding what happened afterward. The city was the plague's most efficient environment. The density of the urban population, the shared water sources, the specific conditions of the medieval city's sanitation that concentrated the rats whose fleas carried the plague, produced higher mortality rates than the dispersed rural population experienced in many regions. The peasant who survived in the village was surviving in an environment that, while devastated, was less comprehensively disrupted than the city. But the rural survivor was facing a specific problem that the urban survivor was not: the land, the specific institution of the medieval land tenure system, the manorial system, the specific legal arrangement by which the peasant was tied to the land, required to perform labor services for the lord, and constrained in their economic and geographic mobility by the feudal obligations that the system imposed, was now operating in a world where the fundamental demographic assumptions on which it had been built were no longer valid. The manorial system had been designed for a world of relative labor surplus, a world where the lord had more labor available than he strictly needed, where the peasant's specific economic vulnerability gave the lord the specific economic leverage that the labor service requirement depended on. The lord needed labor, the peasant needed land. The land was scarce and the labor was abundant, and this specific economic relationship gave the lord the leverage to impose the labor service requirements that the manorial system institutionalized. In 1353, this relationship had been inverted. The lord still needed labor, but the labor was no longer abundant. It was scarce in the specific way of a resource that 25 million deaths had removed from the supply. The peasant's economic position had transformed from the position of the person with no alternatives to the position of the person with, suddenly, multiple alternatives. The specific alternatives created by the reality that the neighboring manor was also short of labor, and the lord of the neighboring manor was quietly, illegally, and with considerable desperation, offering better terms to attract the workers he needed. The specific economic revolution of the post-plague decades was not a planned revolution. It was not the result of the peasants organizing and demanding better terms through the specific collective action of the labor movement that a much later period would develop. It was the result of simple arithmetic, the arithmetic of labor scarcity, creating the leverage that the individual peasant could exploit by the simple act of walking to the next village and accepting the better offer that the labor-hungry lord was making. The lord's response to this arithmetic was a specific response of the institution that sees its structural advantage eroding and attempts to reassert it through the legal mechanism that the authority of the state could provide. In England, the Statute of Labourers of 1351, passed by Parliament 2 years after the first wave of the plague, attempted to freeze wages at the pre-plague levels, to prohibit the movement of labor between manors, and to compel the able-bodied to work at the pre-plague rates for the lords who needed them. The Statute of Labourers was one of the least successfully enforced pieces of legislation in English medieval history, which is saying something in a period when the gap between the law on the paper and the law in practice was routinely vast. The specific problem was the enforcement. The lord, who was supposed to report his neighbor's illegal labor poaching, was often the lord who was himself engaging in labor poaching, and the specific self-interest of the lord class created the specific obstacle to collective enforcement that rendered the statute aspirational rather than effective. The wages rose anyway, not immediately, not uniformly, not without the constant resistance of the lord class that the Statute of Labourers represented. But the wages rose because the arithmetic required them to rise, and the specific trajectory of the English wage data through the second half of the 14th century is the trajectory of the labor market, responding to the most significant labor supply shock in the history of the medieval economy. The real wages of English agricultural laborers, the specific purchasing power of the wages, accounting for the prices of the goods the wages needed to buy, approximately doubled in the decades following the Black Death. The carpenter, the mason, the skilled craftsman saw similar increases. The specific purchasing power of the working person in 1380 was significantly higher than the specific purchasing power of the same category of person in 1340, in ways that the arithmetic of supply and demand explains, and that the moralists and the Parliament and the lords spent the subsequent decades alternatively condemning, regulating, and failing to reverse. Chapter 2. The Peasant Revolution. How the survivors used their new leverage, and what happened when the lords pushed back. The peasant of 1353 knew something had changed, not through the specific theoretical understanding of the labor market that the economics profession would eventually develop, but through the specific, immediate, experiential understanding of the person who had been told their entire life that their situation was fixed and inevitable and divinely ordained, and who was now being offered better wages by the lord of the next village, and finding that the divine ordination was apparently more negotiable than previously advertised. The specific mechanism through which the post-plague peasant exploited the changed situation was not dramatic or organized. It was the quiet, individual, daily exploitation of the specific leverage that labor scarcity created. The peasant who left the manor to work elsewhere. The peasant who negotiated the conversion of their labor service obligation to a cash payment. The specific legal change called commutation that transformed the feudal labor relationship into the cash rent relationship that the medieval economy was gradually moving toward anyway. The peasant who simply refused to perform the labor service and waited to see what the lord would do about it, knowing that the lord's options were more limited than they had been 5 years ago. The lord's options were indeed more limited. The lord who pursued the peasant who had left for the neighboring manor was the lord who had to pursue the case through the manorial court system, the specific legal mechanism of the medieval manorial jurisdiction. and the manorial court system was itself staffed by the people who had survived the plague and who were themselves experiencing the specific labor scarcity that made the rigorous enforcement of the old rules against the new economic reality increasingly difficult to maintain. The specific legal responses to the post-plague labor situation varied by region and by lord. Some lords, recognizing the arithmetic, accepted the commutation of labor services and adjusted to the new cash rent system that was in many respects administratively simpler than the labor service system it replaced. Some lords attempted to enforce the old system through the courts, with mixed results and mounting resentment. Some lords attempted to impose new obligations, the specific additional burdens that the desperate lord added to the existing obligations in an attempt to compensate for the labor shortage through intensified exploitation of the remaining workforce. The intensified exploitation was a specific trigger for the organized resistance that the changed conditions eventually produced. The English peasants' revolt of 1381, the specific political event that was the most visible expression of the post-plague social transformation, was not a spontaneous eruption of the peasant class's resentment. It was the specific consequence of the decade-long tension between the changed economic reality of the labor market and the unchanged, or in some cases, intensified, demands of the legal system that the lord class was using to maintain the old order. The 1381 revolt was triggered by the specific imposition of the poll tax, the flat rate tax on every adult regardless of income that the government had imposed 3 times in 4 years to fund the ongoing military campaigns that the 100 Years' War required. The poll tax was the specific visible injustice that the changed conditions of 1381 made intolerable in ways that the same tax would not have been intolerable in 1340, because the 1381 peasant was a different person from the 1340 peasant, more economically confident, more aware of their own leverage, and more experienced in the specific collective action that the post-plague decades had provided. The revolt's specific events, the march on London, the burning of the legal records that documented the feudal obligations, the meeting with the young King Richard II at Smithfield, where the rebel leader Wat Tyler was killed, and Richard made promises he never intended to keep, were the events of the specific political theater of the medieval uprising. The revolt was suppressed. The promises were not kept. The ringleaders were executed, but the feudal system continued to erode. Not because of the 1381 revolt, which was defeated, but because the arithmetic that had produced the revolt continued to operate regardless of the revolt's suppression. The labor was still scarce. The wages were still higher than the statute of laborers intended. The commutation of labor services was still happening. The peasant, who was no longer legally a serf in the specific sense of the bound laborer, was becoming the peasant, who was legally a serf on paper, but economically a free person in practice. The specific timeline of the end of serfdom in England, the legal institution of the villeinage, the specific legal status that bound the peasant to the lord's land, was not the dramatic legal abolition that a later political tradition would provide. It was the specific, gradual, unremarkable attrition of an institution that the economic reality had made unenforceable. By 1500, villeinage in England was effectively over, not because the Parliament had abolished it, but because the conditions that had made it enforceable no longer existed, and the institution had quietly ceased to function. The specific continental experience varied. In France, the post-plague conditions were complicated by the specific disruption of the 100 Years' War, which ran concurrently with the plague's aftermath, and whose specific devastations, the army of mercenaries without employment who became the routiers, The brigands who terrorized the French countryside in the interwar periods added the specific political and military chaos to the economic disruption of the mortality. The French peasant uprising of 1358, the Jacquerie, was the specific French expression of the same social tensions that produced the English peasants' revolt, with the same specific outcome, suppressed with considerable violence by the nobility that the uprising had threatened. In Germany and Eastern Europe, the trajectory was different, and in some respects reversed. The specific labor scarcity of the post-plague West, the condition that gave the Western peasant their increased leverage, produced a different response in the East, where the lords responded to the labor shortage by intensifying the legal coercion rather than by accepting the market adjustment. The second serfdom of Eastern Europe, the specific legal tightening of the peasants' bonds to the land that the post-plague century produced in Poland, Prussia, and the Eastern territories, was the specific tragic counterpart to the Western relaxation of the feudal system. The lords using the specific legal and political mechanisms available to them to prevent the market adjustment that the Western peasant was achieving. Chapter 3. The Church. How the institution that was supposed to provide answers lost authority by failing to provide them. The Church had a problem. Thus, the specific problem was theological, and it was the specific theological problem of the institution whose fundamental purpose was the explanation of God's relationship with humanity, finding itself unable to explain the most dramatic event in living memory in terms that the surviving population found satisfactory. The Black Death, in the theological framework of the medieval church, was a punishment. The specific theological interpretation of the mortality that the church's intellectual tradition had available was the interpretation of the divine punishment, the specific act of God's wrath expressed through the natural world, directed at the sinful humanity that had failed to maintain the moral standard that the divine order required. This was the theological framework that the sermons preached, and the chroniclers recorded, and the bishop's letters articulated in the specific language of the penitential tradition that the medieval church had developed for exactly this kind of catastrophic event. The theological interpretation was coherent within its framework. It was also, from the perspective of the surviving population, extraordinarily unsatisfying, for the specific reason that the divine punishment theory required the punished to have done something specific to deserve the punishment, and the specific people who had died did not correspond to the specific population that the sin distribution theory predicted. The priests died, the bishops died, the monks died, the nuns in their convents died, the theologians at the universities died. The people whose specific life was the dedicated pursuit of the religious observance that the church prescribed as the appropriate response to God's demands. These people died at approximately the same rate as the people whose life was the dedicated pursuit of the various activities that the church condemned. The divine punishment theory worked well as a narrative device for collective guilt. It worked considerably less well as an explanation for the specific individual mortality that the plague produced. The crisis of faith that the Black Death produced in the medieval European population was not the crisis of atheism. The medieval person who stopped believing in God because of the Black Death is not well documented, because the medieval conceptual framework that produced the crisis also contained the specific religious resources for its resolution. The crisis was more specific, the crisis of the church's authority as the intermediary between humanity and God, the crisis of confidence in the church's specific claim to be the institution through which the divine protection and the divine mercy were channeled to the faithful. The clergy died too fast and too comprehensively for the Church's mediating role to be maintained. In many English dioceses, the mortality of the clergy in the first wave of the plague was over 40%. In some areas, it was significantly higher. The specific consequence was the shortage of clergy that the pastoral needs of the surviving population required, the absence of the priest to administer the last rites to the dying, the absence of the confessor to hear the final confession that the medieval theology required for the specific spiritual safety of the soul at the moment of death. The dying who could not access the last rites because there was no priest left to administer them were the specific pastoral catastrophe of the plague's first wave, and the Church's response. The dispensation that allowed the dying to confess to a layman if no priest was available. The theological adjustments that the emergency required was the specific response of the institution attempting to manage the implications of its own partial collapse. The replacement of the dead clergy with whoever was available. The specific desperation of the episcopal administration scrambling to ordain new clergy to replace the dead, sometimes ordaining men whose qualifications were inadequate by the Church's own standards, produced the specific quality crisis in the post-plague clergy that the subsequent decades of ecclesiastical complaint documented. The priest, who had been ordained quickly in the emergency conditions of the plague's aftermath, was sometimes the priest who could barely read Latin, whose theological education was minimal, whose pastoral preparation was inadequate. This quality crisis in the clergy was one of the specific contributing factors to the disillusionment with the institutional church that the post-plague decades accelerated. The reforming movements of the late 14th and early 15th centuries, the Lollards in England, the Hussites in Bohemia, the various strands of the reforming impulse that eventually produced the Protestant Reformation, were not caused by the Black Death, but they were given specific urgency and specific popular resonance by the post-plague crisis of confidence in the Church's institutional authority. John Wycliffe, the English theologian who developed the intellectual framework for the Lollard movement in the 1370s, was doing his most radical work approximately 20 years after the Black Death's first wave, in the specific context of a church whose authority had been shaken by the mortality and whose institutional response to the crisis had produced the specific contradictions and inadequacies that the reforming impulse found most useful. The translation of the Bible into English that the Lollard movement pursued. The specific radical act of making the scripture available to the laity in their own language, bypassing the clerical monopoly on the sacred text, was the specific theological consequence of the post-plague crisis of confidence in clerical mediation. John Hus in Bohemia, the specific Bohemian reformer who built on Wycliffe's framework, and whose execution in 1415 produced the Hussite Wars that consumed Bohemia for a generation, was another specific example of the reforming energy that the post-plague decades had generated. The Hussites' specific demands, communion in both kinds for the laity, the preaching of the gospel in the vernacular, the reduction of clerical privilege and clerical wealth, were the demands of the post-plague lay population that had experienced the Church's specific failures during the mortality and had drawn the specific conclusions that experience allowed. The flagellant movement was the other specific religious response to the Black Death, and it is worth dwelling on because it reveals something specific and important about the psychology of the post-plague religious experience. The flagellants, the specific movement that organized processions of penitents who whipped themselves publicly in the belief that the self-inflicted suffering would appease the divine wrath that the plague represented, were the most dramatic visible expression of the post-plague religious psychology. The flagellant movement spread across Germany and the Low Countries and into France in 1348 and 1349. The processions moving from town to town, the penitents performing their public self-flagellation in the specific ritual form that the movement had developed, drawing the crowds of onlookers who found in the spectacle both the specific religious comfort of the collective penitential act and the specific entertainment of the extraordinary public performance. The Church's response to the flagellants was eventually condemnation. Pope Clement VI issued the papal bull condemning the flagellant movement in October 1349 on the specific grounds that the movement was conducting religious rituals without clerical oversight and was making theological claims. The specific claim that the self-inflicted suffering could substitute for confession and priestly absolution, that the Church's authority required to be resisted. The condemnation was justified on the institutional grounds that the Church's authority was being bypassed. And it is in this specific dimension that the flagellant movement is most revealing about the post-plague religious situation. The movement was the specific expression of the lay population's attempt to take religious agency into their own hands in the specific absence of the clerical mediation that the mortality had disrupted. Chapter 4. The Jews, the specific horror of the scapegoating, and what it reveals about post-plague society. The Jews of Europe did not cause the Black Death. This requires stating because the medieval European population's response to the Black Death included the specific terrible decision to blame the Jewish communities for the catastrophe. And the specific violence that this decision produced was one of the most concentrated waves of anti-Semitic persecution in European history before the 20th century. The mechanism of the blaming was the specific false accusation of well poisoning, the claim that the Jews had poisoned the wells and the water supplies of the Christian communities as the specific method by which the plague had been deliberately introduced. The accusation was false in every respect. There was no well poisoning. The Jews were dying of the plague at comparable rates to the Christian population, and the specific epidemiology of the plague, the pattern of its spread through trade routes and population centers, was entirely inconsistent with the deliberate well poisoning theory. But the accusation was useful in the specific ways that the scapegoating of minority communities is always useful to the populations that deploy it in times of catastrophe. The accusation provided an explanation, the specific explanation of deliberate human agency for a catastrophe that the theological framework's divine punishment explanation was failing to make satisfying. The accusation provided a target, the specific identifiable human enemy, for the rage and the grief and the terror of the population that had watched a third of the people it knew die in the past 2 years. And the accusation provided an opportunity, the specific economic opportunity of the Christian communities that owed money to Jewish lenders, and that saw in the persecution and the expulsion of the Jewish communities the specific possibility of the debt's cancellation. The massacres began in 1348, before the plague had fully arrived in many of the places where the massacres occurred. The specific irony of the community killing its Jewish neighbors for causing a plague that had not yet arrived in their town. The Rhineland cities, the specific urban centers of the German Jewish communities, were the epicenter of the violence. Worms, Speyer, Strasbourg, Mainz, Cologne. The Jewish communities of these cities were massacred in 1348 and 1349. The populations burned in the specific mass burnings that the medieval persecution deployed as its most extreme form. In Strasbourg, the Jewish community was burned alive on February 14, 1349. St. Valentine's Day, and the specific grim irony of the historical date. On the accusation of the well poisoning that the bishop and the city's secular authorities had separately investigated and found baseless, the city council that had resisted the accusation and tried to protect the Jewish community was overthrown by the guilds that wanted the persecution, and the new council ordered the burning. The debts that the Strasbourg Christians owed to the Jewish community were canceled. The property was confiscated. The Jewish quarter was allocated to the guilds that had overthrown the council. Pope Clement VI, who condemned the flagellants, also condemned the massacres. His papal bull of July 1348, issued from Avignon, where the papal court had retreated from Rome, specifically and explicitly stated that the Jews were not responsible for the plague, that the accusations of well poisoning were false, that the plague was also killing Jews in vast numbers, which was inconsistent with the deliberate introduction theory, and that the Christian faithful were to stop killing their Jewish neighbors. The papal condemnation was largely ignored. The Jewish communities of the Rhineland were effectively eliminated, the survivors expelled from cities that had been Jewish communities for centuries. The specific social and economic fabric of the Rhineland Jewish world destroyed in the 2 years of the persecution. Some Jewish communities survived by fleeing east into Poland and Lithuania and the eastern territories, where the local rulers were willing to offer protection in exchange for the economic services that the Jewish communities provided. The specific consequence for the surviving Jewish communities of Eastern Europe, the communities of Poland, Lithuania, and the territories that would eventually become the Russian Pale of Settlement, was the demographic transformation of the European Jewish population's geographic distribution that the Western massacres produced. The concentration of European Jewish populations in Eastern Europe that the 20th century's Holocaust would target was the specific consequence of the 14th century's persecutions, the medieval catastrophe shaping the geography of a later catastrophe with the specific tragic logic of the chain of consequences. Chapter 5. The Arts. How the Black Death changed what European art looked like, and why the change was. Fine. Extraordinary. You are standing in front of a painting. The painting is a dance of death, the danse macabre, the specific artistic genre that the post-plague period invented and that the European artistic tradition produced in extraordinary quantity in the decades following the Black Death. The painting shows death, personified as the skeleton, the corpse, the figure of death in its various representations, dancing with representatives of every social class. The Pope and the Emperor, the Bishop and the Knight, the merchant and the peasant, the young woman and the child, all are dancing with death. All are being led toward the grave, regardless of their earthly status. All are equal in the specific democracy of the mortality that the plague had just demonstrated with devastating empirical thoroughness. The danse macabre is not subtle. It is not the gentle memento mori of the earlier medieval tradition, the quiet skull on the scholar's desk, the reminder that life is finite placed unobtrusively among the symbols of learning and achievement. The danse macabre is the insistent, unavoidable, comprehensive presence of death in every dimension of human life. The artistic statement of a culture that had just watched a third of its members die, and that was processing this experience through the specific medium of the visual art that the medieval tradition had developed for exactly this kind of theological and psychological reckoning. The specific artistic innovation of the post-plague period was the innovation of the realistic corpse. The pre-plague artistic tradition had represented death in the specific, stylized way of the medieval aesthetic. the dead Christ of the Romanesque tradition, is recognizably a representation of death, but it is a death filtered through the specific theological and artistic conventions of the tradition that made it more symbol than depiction. The post-plague tradition produced something different. The Gazant, the tomb effigy that represented the corpse in the specific physical detail of the decomposing body. The Transai tomb, the specific tomb design that represented the deceased in two registers, the idealized figure above and the decomposing corpse below, was the post-plague invention that expressed the specific psychological tension of the period most directly. The top of the tomb showed the deceased in the idealized representation of their earthly dignity. The knight in his armor, the bishop in his vestments, the lady in her finest dress. The bottom of the tomb showed the same person as the worm-eaten corpse, the body in the specific stages of decomposition that the medieval eye, which had seen a great deal of actual decomposition in the plague years, represented with the realistic accuracy of the lived experience. The transy tomb was not the artistic statement of the morbid individual. It was the theological statement of the institution, the church, the patrons, the social hierarchy, about the relationship between earthly dignity and the democratic reality of death. It was the visual argument that the plague's mortality had made in demographic terms, now being made in artistic terms, that the earthly distinctions of the social hierarchy were temporary, that the decomposition of the corpse did not respect the rank of the person it had been, that the equality of death was the most fundamental equality of the human condition. Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, written between 1348 and 1353, in the specific years of the plague's first and most devastating wave, is the literary work that most directly processes the Black Death's psychological impact in the literary form that the Italian humanist tradition had developed. The Decameron's framing device, the 7 young women and 3 young men who flee Florence as the plague ravages the city and who spend 10 days telling stories in a country villa, is the specific narrative strategy of the work that finds in the storytelling the specific response to the catastrophe that the tradition of the literary art offers. The stories themselves range from the bawdy to the tragic to the darkly comic, and the specific mixture, the comedy alongside the tragedy, the earthly delight alongside the awareness of death, is the specific psychological response to the plague's mortality that Boccaccio was articulating. The specific message of the Decameron is not simple or didactic. It is not the message of the religious penitential tradition that says, remember death and repent. It is closer to the message of the person who has watched a third of the people they knew die and has concluded that the appropriate response to this knowledge is to live fully, to enjoy the earthly pleasures that the mortality had demonstrated were temporary, to find in the story and the laughter in the company the specific human affirmation that the plague's devastation had threatened to extinguish. The specific artistic production of the post-plague decades in Italy, the generation of Boccaccio, the generation that produced the specific literary and artistic works that the Renaissance would build on, was the artistic production of the culture that had been through the catastrophe and had found, in the specific response of the creative intellect to the specific challenge of the mortality, the new forms and the new energies that the Renaissance would eventually name as its origin. Chapter 6. The Women, How the Labor Shortage Transformed the Economic Position of Half the Population. The widow was running the brewery, not because she had specifically planned to run a brewery, not because the specific social conventions of the medieval world had decided that widows running breweries was an appropriate arrangement that the institution of the widow's management of the late husband's enterprise could formally accommodate, but because her husband was dead, the plague had killed him in the autumn of 1349, and the brewery still needed to be run, and she was there, and she knew how it worked because she had been running the practical daily operations of the enterprise alongside her husband for the previous 15 years, while he handled the commercial and legal aspects that the male legal personhood of the medieval world required. The Black Death's impact on women's economic position was the specific, dramatic impact of the labor shortage, operating on the specific structural constraints of the medieval gender economy. The medieval economy had a defined role for women's labor, extensive, valuable, and largely unrecognized in the formal economic record, and a defined set of barriers to women's participation in the formal economic structures of the guild system, the civic commerce, and the legal personhood that the formal economy required. The labor shortage eroded these barriers with the specific, practical logic of the situation that valued the available worker over the theoretical propriety of the available worker's gender. The guild system in many medieval cities had explicitly prohibited women's full membership. The specific formal barrier of the guild ordinances that reserved the master status and its associated commercial rights for the male practitioner. In the post-plague decades, these ordinances were bent, stretched, and in some cases explicitly modified to accommodate the reality that the guild's dead members needed to be replaced, and the most available replacements were sometimes women. The specific craft areas where women's post-plague participation is most documented are the areas where the pre-plague women's work had been most extensive. The textile trades, spinning, weaving, dyeing, and the various finishing operations that the cloth production required had always included substantial women's labor, typically in the most labor-intensive and least rewarded parts of the production chain. After the plague, women appear in greater numbers in the more skilled and more financially rewarding parts of the textile trade. As independent weavers, as cloth merchants, as the mistresses of the workshops that produced the cloth that the surviving market demanded. The brewing was the specific, important case of the post-plague women's economic expansion, the specific trade in which the pre-plague women's involvement was extensive at the domestic and small-scale commercial levels, and in which the post-plague labor shortage and the deaths of the male brewers pushed women into the formal commercial brewing that the medieval economy's largest beverage industry required. The alewife, the specific female brewer of the medieval tradition, was a pre-plague institution, but the post-plague decades saw the specific expansion of the alewife's commercial role into the larger scale, more formally organized brewing enterprises that had previously been more exclusively male. The widow's specific legal position in the medieval common law was the specific, limited legal personhood that allowed the widow, and only the widow, not the wife, to act as a legal person in the commercial domain of her late husband's enterprise. The feme sole trader, the specific legal status that some medieval cities granted to women engaged in trade, was the formal accommodation of the reality that women were doing commercial work, and the post-plague expansion of the feme sole's presence in the surviving records reflects the specific expansion of women's formal commercial participation that the labor shortage produced. The medical trades were the other specific area of post-plague women's expansion. The specific healing and nursing work that the plague had created demand for in quantities that the formal male medical profession could not supply, and that the women practitioners of the empirical medical tradition had expanded into with the specific practical competence of the people who had been doing the actual work of healing, regardless of whether the guild system or the university system recognized them as doing it. The empirica, the term that the formal medical tradition used for the unlicensed practitioner, typically with the specific contempt of the credentialed for the uncredentialed, was often a woman, and the post-plague demand for any medical assistance that was available had expanded the practical space in which the women healers operated. The herbalists, the midwives, the practical nurses who had always existed outside the formal medical system found their services in greater demand, and their informal authority expanded by the specific crisis that had created the need for anyone who could help. The specific long-term trajectory of women's post-plague economic position was not the linear trajectory toward the equality that the initial expansion might have suggested. The lords and the guilds and the civic authorities that had bent the rules during the acute crisis of the labor shortage showed the consistent tendency across the post-plague decades to reassert the old rules as the demographic recovery gradually restored the labor supply. The specific reassertion of women's exclusion from the guild system that the later 14th and early 15th centuries documented the specific tightening of the guild ordinances that the recovery period produced was the reassertion of the male economic privilege that the crisis had temporarily suspended, but the crack that the plague had opened was not entirely sealed. The specific changes in women's legal and economic position that the post-plague decades produced, the expanded use of the widow's legal status, the fee-maisel trading rights in the craft centers, the informal authority of the women healers and practitioners persisted in modified forms through the subsequent centuries, and the specific expansion of the women's economic agency in the crisis period of the 14th century was one of the specific historical moments that the longer history of women's economic participation charts as a significant transition. Chapter 7. The Medicine. How the Black Death broke medieval medicine and accidentally improved it. The physicians had no idea what was happening. This is worth stating clearly and without the specific retrospective condescension of the modern person who knows what the bubonic plague is and finds the medieval physicians' failure to identify it disappointing. The medieval physician was working with the best medical knowledge that their tradition had developed. The humoral theory, the Galenic framework, the specific intellectual inheritance of the classical and Islamic medical traditions that the medieval university had organized and transmitted. And the bubonic plague was not something that this tradition had encountered, characterized, or developed treatment for. The humoral theory's explanation of the plague was the humoral theory's explanation of any severe illness, an imbalance in the humors, the specific corruption of the air, the miasma that the rotting matter and the bad alignment of the planets had produced, the specific explanation that the Paris medical faculty produced in 1348. In the official report that the King of France had commissioned, attributed the plague to the specific conjunction of Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars in Aquarius in 1345, which had produced the corruption of the air that the disease represented. This was not a stupid answer within the framework that the Paris medical faculty was working with. It was the specific, sophisticated application of the intellectual framework they had to the most significant medical crisis they had encountered, produced by the best educated physicians in Europe, delivered to the most powerful patron in France, and it was completely wrong in every relevant dimension. The treatment recommendations were correspondingly ineffective. The avoidance of the corrupted air, the specific recommendation to flee from the infected areas, which was one of the few plague recommendations that actually worked, for the specific reason that increasing one's distance from the source of the flea-infested rats reduced the exposure to the disease vector. The application of the theriac, the complex polypharmaceutical preparation of the medieval tradition, the specific multi-ingredient compound that the medieval physician's tradition had inherited from the classical world, and that was supposed to counteract any poison, which was completely ineffective against Yersinia pestis. The bloodletting, the specific humoral treatment that removed the excess of the humor responsible for the disease, which was actively harmful to the patient whose physiological reserves were already depleted by the infection. The plague killed physicians, not only because the physicians were exposed to the disease through their attendance on the sick, which they were, but because the specific courage of attending on the plague patients in the conditions of the 1348 epidemic was the specific professional obligation that many physicians met and that many physicians died meeting. The physician who died attending plague patients was not the coward of the specific accusation that the moralists sometimes made against the flight of the better off from the infected cities. They were the specific professional martyr of the medical tradition that required attendance on the sick as the physician's primary obligation. The post-plague development of European medicine was not the linear improvement that the narrative of medical progress sometimes presents. The immediate post-plague decades produced the specific crisis of the depleted medical faculty. The universities whose medical faculties had been reduced by the mortality, the specific gap in the transmission of the medical knowledge that the deaths of the experienced teachers created, the rapid replacement of the dead with the inexperienced, the ordination of the clergy's quality crisis replicated in the academic medicine's staffing crisis, produced the specific quality reduction in the formal medical teaching that the post-plague decades had to manage. But the longer-term consequence of the Black Death for European medicine was the specific inadvertent improvement that the catastrophic failure of the existing framework produced. The plague had demonstrated, beyond any reasonable doubt, that the existing medical tradition did not work. Not for the plague, and by implication not for much else either. The specific systematic failure of the humoral theory and the Galenic therapeutics in the face of the plague created the specific intellectual space for the questioning of the received tradition that the medical humanism of the Renaissance would eventually fill. The anatomical tradition was the specific medical development that the post-plague decades accelerated. The specific turn toward the examination of the actual human body as the source of the medical knowledge, rather than the textual tradition of the classical authorities that the medieval university had treated as the primary evidence. The dissection that the medical faculties conducted more regularly after the plague, in the specific attempt to understand the disease's mechanism through the direct examination of the body, was the specific empirical turn in medical thinking that the catastrophe's failure of the textual tradition had promoted. Guy de Chauliac, the French physician who survived the Black Death and whose Chirurgia Magna, written in the 1360s, is one of the most important medical texts of the later medieval period, is the specific example of the physician who had been through the catastrophe and had drawn the specific practical conclusions that experience allowed. De Chauliac's text included the specific first systematic description of the bubonic plague's clinical course, the buboes, the specific progression of the disease, the outcomes that the direct clinical observation of a physician who had treated plague patients produced. It was not an accurate understanding of the disease's mechanism, but it was the specific empirical beginning of the systematic clinical description that the subsequent centuries of plague management would build on. The Arabic medical tradition's influence on European medicine was the specific intellectual resource that the post-plague decades drew on with increasing urgency. The specific, sophisticated clinical and pharmacological knowledge of the Islamic medical tradition that the translation movement had been making available to European scholars since the 12th century, and that the plague's demonstration of the inadequacy of the received European framework made newly attractive. The works of Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd and the specific clinical wisdom of the Arabic tradition were the intellectual resources that the post-plague European physician found more useful than the classical tradition that the plague had so comprehensively failed. The quarantine was a specific public health innovation that the post-plague Italian cities developed in the immediate aftermath of the epidemic. The specific practical application of the observation that the disease spread through contact and movement, and that the control of contact and movement could reduce the spread. Venice established the first formal quarantine in 1377. The specific 40-day isolation requirement for ships arriving from plague-affected ports whose name, quarantino, gave the English language the word quarantine that we still use for the same practice. The quarantine was the specific pre-scientific public health measure that worked, not through any understanding of the germ theory of disease, but through the specific empirical observation that isolation reduced transmission and the specific administrative implementation of that observation in the formal public health regulation that the Italian city-states developed. The quarantine was, in this specific respect, the most important medical innovation of the post-plague period. The specific, practical health intervention that the catastrophe had produced through the observation of what had happened rather than through the understanding of why it happened. Chapter 8. The Economy After Death. How 25 million deaths restructured European commerce. The land was available. This was the specific, startling economic reality of the post-plague decades. The enormous quantity of land that the mortality had transferred from the dead to the living through the specific mechanisms of inheritance, escheat, and the simple vacancy of the property, whose owners had died without heirs, or whose heirs had also died. In a medieval economy where land was the primary form of wealth and its access was the primary determinant of economic status, the specific massive redistribution of land that 25 million deaths produced was the most fundamental economic event in centuries. The land market of the post-plague decades was the land market of the specific strange situation where supply had dramatically expanded at the same moment that demand was dramatically reduced. The dead landowners of the mortality creating the available property that the surviving purchasers could acquire at prices that would have been impossible before the plague, because the competition for land that had characterized the overcrowded pre-plague land market had been reduced by the same mortality that had created the supply. The specific peasant who survived the plague with some monetary savings, the specific modest accumulation of the agricultural laborer or the craft worker who had saved over the years, found themselves in the specific, historically unprecedented position of being able to purchase land that the pre-plague land market would have made inaccessible at any price. The wealthy merchant who survived with their wealth intact found the land market offering the specific, dramatic expansion of their land portfolio that the pre-plague competition had prevented. The consolidation of land holdings was the specific economic process of the post-plague decades that the availability of abandoned and underpriced land enabled. the specific aggregation of the small holdings of the dead into the larger holdings of the surviving landowners, creating the economic shift toward the larger agricultural units that the subsequent centuries of English agricultural development would continue. The enclosure movement, the specific legal process by which the common land of the medieval village was enclosed and converted to the private pasture of the larger landowner, had pre-plague origins but accelerated dramatically in the post-plague decades for the specific reason that the labor shortage had made pastoral farming, sheep on enclosed pasture managed with few workers, economically more attractive relative to the arable farming that required the substantial workforce that the labor shortage had made expensive and scarce. The shift from arable to pastoral, the specific economic decision of the surviving landowner who calculated that the sheep that required 2 shepherds to manage a flock of 300 was more economic than the wheat that required 30 laborers to work the same area, was the specific agricultural transformation that the post-plague labor economics produced. The wool that the sheep produced was the raw material of the European textile industry, the most internationally traded commodity in the medieval economy, and the specific English advantage in wool production that the shift to pastoral created was the specific competitive advantage that the English textile industry would build on through the subsequent centuries. The prices of agricultural goods fell in the post-plague decades, the specific counterintuitive economic consequence of the mortality that reduced not only the labor supply, but also the population that needed to be fed. The food demand declined with the population. The food supply after the initial disruption of the mortality adjusted more slowly. The land was still productive, the surviving livestock still bred, the farm still produced. The specific excess supply of food relative to the reduced demand produced the specific fall in agricultural prices that the post-plague decades documented. The falling food prices combined with the rising wages produced the specific real wage increase of the post-plague laborer that we discussed in the first chapter. The double benefit of earning more while paying less for food that represented the specific dramatic improvement in the material standard of living of the surviving working population. This improvement was real, documented, and was experienced by the people who lived through it as the specific unexpected benefit of the catastrophe. The darker irony of the mortality having improved the material conditions of those it had not killed. The luxury goods market was the specific economic sector that benefited most dramatically from the post-plague increase in the real wages and the wealth redistribution that the mortality produced. The surviving artisan, who was now earning double the pre-plague wage and who faced reduced competition from the dead colleagues for the available customers, was the artisan with the specific economic capacity to purchase the better quality goods that the pre-plague wage had placed beyond reach. The goldsmiths, the weavers of fine cloth, the makers of the decorated furniture and the carved ivory and the illuminated manuscript, the specific luxury craft producers of the medieval economy, found in the post-plague decade a market that was simultaneously depleted in population and enriched in purchasing power. The specific economic phenomenon of the post-plague luxury surge, the documented increase in the production and consumption of luxury goods in the decades following the mortality, was the economic expression of the specific psychological response of the survivor to the catastrophe. The person who had watched a third of the people they knew die, who had processed the specific theological and philosophical challenge of the mortality, who had arrived at some version of the conclusion that Boccaccio's Decameron expressed, that the earthly pleasures were to be enjoyed because the mortality had demonstrated their fragility, was the person who spent the increased wages on the decorated cup, and the embroidered gown, and the carved ivory panel, rather than on the frugal accumulation of the Puritan tradition. The sumptuary laws were the specific legislative response of the surviving noble class to the specific economic threat of the luxury surge, the threat that the nouveau riche of the post-plague labor market was using their increased purchasing power to acquire the material markers of social status that the noble class had previously monopolized. The laws against the merchant's wife wearing silk, against the artisan displaying the gold jewelry that was the specific visual marker of the social distinction that the medieval hierarchy maintained. These laws were the specific legislative attempt to reassert the social hierarchy through the control of the consumption that the wage increase had made possible. The sumptuary laws were the specific legislative equivalent of the statute of laborers, the attempt by the threatened elite to use the legal mechanism to maintain the social reality that the economic reality was eroding. They were approximately as effective. The merchant's wife continued to wear silk. The artisan's family continued to eat meat at frequencies that the pre-plague standards had reserved for the Lord's table. The economic arithmetic of the labor market continued to override the legislative intention of the social order that the arithmetic was disrupting. Chapter 9. The Children. How the Black Death affected the next generation, and what they inherited. The children who were born in the 1350s and 1360s were born into a world that had no living memory of the pre-plague world, not the children born in 1348 or 1349, who were too young to form the specific, lasting memories that the adult experience of the plague would produce. The children born in 1355 or 1365, the children of the survivors, the specific generation that the post-plague recovery produced, were born into the world that the mortality had left, and the specific characteristics of that world were the characteristics that this generation would experience as normal rather than as the aftermath of catastrophe. The demographic recovery was slower than the arithmetic of reproduction might suggest. The specific biological and social factors that the post-plague demographic situation produced were not the factors that promoted rapid population growth. The marriage patterns changed. The specific post-plague marriage behavior that the demographic records of the surviving registers document shows the earlier marriage ages that the labor market's improved conditions permitted. The remarriage rates that the widows and widowers of the mortality displayed in greater numbers than the pre-plague rates. But the children of the post-plague marriages were growing up in the specific demographic reality of the depleted population that the recovery had not yet refilled. The Europe of 1380 was still substantially less populated than the Europe of 1340, despite 3 decades of recovery births. The specific timeline of the demographic recovery, the return to pre-plague population levels, was not achieved in England until approximately 1600, 2.5 centuries after the first wave of the mortality. The specific depth of the demographic wound that the Black Death had inflicted required the specific long duration of the recovery that the subsequent plague waves, the recurrences of 1361, 1369, 1374 to 79, and the various subsequent waves that punctuated the later 14th and 15th centuries kept interrupting. The children of the post-plague generation grew up with the plague as a recurring presence rather than a concluded event. The recurrences that followed the first wave hit the children and the young adults with the specific devastating efficiency of the disease attacking the cohorts that had not yet been exposed. and had therefore not acquired even the partial immunity that the survivors of the first wave had developed. The 1,361 recurrence, sometimes called the Plague of Children, killed a disproportionate number of the young people who had been born after the 1348 to 1349 wave and who lacked the specific immunological experience that the adult survivors possessed. The orphan was a specific demographic product of the Black Death that the medieval social system had to absorb in extraordinary numbers. The children who had lost one or both parents in the first wave of the mortality, the specific parentless children of the catastrophe, required the specific social support of the extended family, the church, the guild structure, and the manorial system to absorb. The medieval tradition of the apprenticeship, the specific institutional arrangement by which the child was placed in the household of the master craftsman and received the training and the maintenance that the arrangement required, expanded in the post-plague period partly as the specific mechanism for managing the orphan population that the mortality had produced. The specific cultural inheritance of the post-plague generation was the inheritance of the memento mori, the specific cultural saturation with the awareness of death, and the specific artistic and theological tradition of the mortality that the post-plague decades had produced. The child who grew up in the 1350s and 1360s grew up in the specific world of the transi-tomb and the danse macabre and the plague pit and the recurrent epidemic, the world in which the death of the people around them was not the exceptional event that it is in the modern experience, but the recurring, expected, calendar-marked reality of the medieval post-plague life. The specific psychological legacy of this cultural saturation, the particular relationship that the post-plague generation had with death, with the body, with the impermanence of earthly life, was the psychological inheritance that the Ars Moriendi tradition was produced to address. The Ars Moriendi, the specific devotional literature of the art of dying well, that the late medieval period produced in extraordinary quantity, was the specific practical guide to the death that the mortality had made universally present, and that the surviving population needed the specific cultural technology of the religious tradition to manage. The education of the post-plague generation was the education of the institution whose faculty had been depleted by the mortality and whose student population had been reduced by the same. The universities of Europe, Oxford and Cambridge in England, Paris in France, Bologna and Padua in Italy, Prague in Bohemia, had all suffered the specific faculty mortality of the plague's first wave, and the specific recovery of the university system required the replacement of the dead teachers with whoever was available, and the management of the specific quality gap that the emergency replacement produced. The specific positive consequence of the post-plague university crisis was the specific expansion of the university system that the recovery period produced, the founding of new universities in the cities and regions where the plague had demonstrated the specific need for the trained physicians and lawyers and theologians that the mortality had consumed. The University of Vienna was founded in 1365, Heidelberg in 1386, Cologne in 1388. The specific wave of new university foundations in the post-plague decades was the institutional response to the specific educated professional shortage that the mortality had created and that the recovery required. Chapter 10. The Recurrences. How the plague kept coming back and what that did to everyone's psychology. The plague came back in 1361. This was the specific psychological catastrophe of the post-plague world that the survivors of the first wave had not fully prepared for. The return of the thing they had thought was over. The specific optimism of 1353. The careful, tentative sense that the worst was behind them, that the rebuilding could begin, that the dead had been mourned, and the living could now attend to living, was the optimism that the 1361 recurrence dismantled. The 1361 plague was different from the 1348 wave in specific ways that the contemporary observers noted and that the modern epidemiological analysis confirms. The 1361 epidemic was less comprehensively lethal than the 1348 wave. The specific mortality was lower, partly because the survivors of 1348 had some degree of immunological experience with the pathogen, and partly because the specific strain of Yersinia pestis in 1361 may have been somewhat less virulent, but lower was not low. The 1361 mortality was still catastrophic by any standard except the comparison to 1348, and the specific demographic damage of the recurrence hit the children and the young adults, the cohorts who had been born after 1348, or who had been too young in 1348 to have developed even partial immunity, with disproportionate force. The specific psychological effect of the recurrence was the specific effect of the interruption of the recovery. The sense that the new world being built on the ruins of the old world was itself at risk, that the plague was not the concluded catastrophe, but the recurring condition of the new reality. The specific theological response to this understanding, the understanding that the plague was not a single punishment, but an ongoing feature of the divine management of the human situation, was the theological response of the institution that had to explain not one catastrophe, but the permanent possibility of catastrophe. The development of the plague psychology, the specific cultural relationship with the plague that the repeated recurrences produced in the European population of the later 14th and 15th centuries, was the development of the normalized emergency. The generation that had grown up in the post-plague world and that had survived one or more recurrences developed the specific adaptive relationship with the epidemic that the permanently threatened population develops. The monitoring of the plague's progress through the specific information networks of the period, the specific practical preparations of the household for the epidemic's arrival, the specific social behaviors of the plague season, the avoidance of the sick, the limitation of the social gatherings, the specific practical quarantine behaviors that the Italian cities were formalizing, and that the populations of the northern cities were practicing informally. The plague seasons became part of the calendar, not literally. The plague did not arrive on a predictable schedule the way the harvest arrived or the feast days arrived, but psychologically, the European population of the late 14th and 15th centuries lived with the specific background awareness of the plague's potential arrival in the specific way that the inhabitants of the earthquake zone live with the background awareness of the earthquake's potential arrival. Always there, rarely the immediate emergency, but shaping the specific psychological orientation of the people who know it could happen at any time. The specific social behaviors that the plague psychology produced were the behaviors of the population that had internalized the specific calculus of the epidemic's risk. The avoidance of the sick, the specific described social behavior of the plague season, was the pre-scientific quarantine behavior that the observation of the disease's transmission had produced in the population, regardless of whether the formal medical or political institutions had organized it. the abandonment of the sick by their families, the specific, described behavior of the worst plague periods that the moralists condemned and the desperate explained, was the specific, individual quarantine behavior of the person who had calculated correctly that the attendance on the sick increased the probability of becoming sick. The specific cultural production of the later plague decades was the cultural production of the society that had normalized the emergency. The literature and the art and the philosophy that the recurring mortality had shaped into the specific forms of the late medieval world. The works of Geoffrey Chaucer, the Canterbury Tales, written in the 1380s and 1390s, reflect the specific cultural synthesis of the post-plague English world, the vitality and the humor and the earthly engagement of Boccaccio's response to the mortality filtered through the specific English social observation of the Canterbury Pilgrimage's diverse cast, alive to the specific comedy and tragedy of the world that the plague had not simplified but had made more urgently present. The specific mystical tradition of the late medieval period was also the product of the plague psychology. The specific turned toward the direct, personal relationship with the divine that the plague's disruption of the clerical mediation had promoted and that the recurring mortality had made urgently felt. Julian of Norwich, the English mystic whose revelations of divine love, written in the 1370s and revised in the 1390s, is one of the most extraordinary documents of the medieval spiritual tradition, was writing in the specific post-plague world of the recurrent epidemic, addressing the specific theological challenge of the mortality through the specific personal mystical experience that the tradition of the direct divine encounter provided. Julian's specific theological response to the mortality, the famous "all shall be well" and "all shall be well, and all manner of thing shall be well," was not the theology of the person who had not understood the scale of the catastrophe. It was the theology of the specific person who had understood it completely and had arrived through the specific intellectual and spiritual work of the mystic at the specific theological position that the divine love was not negated by the mortality, but was, in ways that the human understanding could not fully grasp, consistent with it. Chapter 11. The Flagellants and the Fringes. The extreme religious responses and why they mattered. The man walking through your town is bleeding, not from a wound, from the specific self-inflicted cuts that the leather scourge with its iron spikes has made in the skin of his back, which he has been beating himself with 3 times a day for the past 33 days, in the specific ritual discipline of the flagellant movement that he joined after the plague, took his wife and 3 of his 4 children in the autumn of 1349. He is not alone. There are 40 of them, walking in the specific procession that the flagellant movement organized, chanting the specific penitential hymns that the movement had developed, the blood mixing with the sweat and the road dust on their backs, the crowd of onlookers watching with the specific combination of the horror and the admiration that the extreme religious performance always generates. The flagellant movement's theology was the theology of the specific extreme form of the penitential tradition, the tradition that the suffering of the body could address the spiritual debt that the sin had created. The specific claim of the flagellant movement, the claim that the Pope's bull of condemnation identified as the specific heretical departure from the Church's orthodoxy, was the claim that the 33.5 days of the flagellant discipline could produce the specific spiritual benefit of the plenary indulgence, bypassing the sacramental system of the Church entirely. The 33.5 days was the specific, carefully calculated duration, 1 day for each year of Christ's life, that the movement had determined as the appropriate penance for the specific catastrophic sin that had produced the catastrophic plague. The calculation was the calculation of the movement's theology. The plague was the divine punishment for sin. The sin required penance proportionate to its severity. The severity of the plague indicated the severity of the sin, and the specific severe penance of the self-flagellation for the 33.5 days was the specific adequate response to the specific divine demand. The movement's anti-Semitism was a specific terrible dimension of the flagellant tradition that its theology made structural rather than incidental. The flagellant processions were consistently associated with the attacks on Jewish communities. The specific violence of the anti-Semitic accusation that the flagellant movement carried from town to town as part of the specific theological package of its worldview. The well-poisoning accusation that we discussed in the Jewish chapter traveled with the flagellant movement through Germany in 1348 and 1349. The processions sometimes serving as the specific organizational nucleus around which the local anti-Semitic violence crystallized. The Church's condemnation of the flagellants, the Papal Bull of October 1349, was the specific institutional response to the movement's theological departures and its anti-Semitic violence. The condemnation was enforced with the specific effectiveness of the 14th century Church's enforcement mechanisms, which were constrained by the same mortality that had reduced the clergy's capacity for every other administrative function. The movement subsided partly because of the condemnation, and partly because the plague's first wave was subsiding simultaneously, removing the specific acute urgency that had driven the recruitment into the extreme religious response. But the flagellant impulse did not disappear entirely. The movement resurfaced with each subsequent plague recurrence, the specific extreme religious response to the mortality recurring with the mortality itself. The later flagellant movements of the 14th and 15th centuries were smaller, more locally organized, and more comprehensively condemned by the Church than the 1348 to 1349 movement, but they were the specific evidence that the religious psychology of the post-plague world included the specific recurring impulse toward the extreme penitential response that the mortality's recurrence kept activating. The heretical movements of the post-plague period were the other dimension of the religious fringe that the mortality had energized. The Brethren of the Free Spirit, the specific antinomian movement that the Church had condemned before the plague, but that the post-plague religious disruption gave a new audience, claimed the specific theological position that the soul that had achieved spiritual perfection was freed from the moral law that governed the unregenerate. The specific practical implication that some of the Free Spirit's adherents drew from this theological position, the implication that the spiritually perfect person could engage in any behavior without sin, was the specific antinomian claim that the Church found most threatening and most comprehensively condemned. The apocalyptic movements were the specific religious tradition of the post-plague world that the mortality had most directly energized. The specific millenarian expectation that the plague was the beginning of the end times, that the catastrophe was the specific prophesied tribulation that preceded the second coming, that the proper response to the dying was not the reconstruction of the interrupted normal life, but the specific urgent preparation for the imminent divine transformation. The Joachite tradition, the specific prophetic framework of the 12th century Cistercian abbot Joachim of Fiore, who had developed an elaborate historical theology of the three ages of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, was the specific intellectual resource of the post-plague apocalypticism, the framework that provided the specific prophetic structure in which the plague could be understood as the specific penultimate event of the divine historical plan rather than the random catastrophe of the neutral universe. Chapter 12. The Politics. How the Black Death reshaped power and what the new power looked like. The king was dead. Not the specific king of the specific country, several specific kings in fact. King Alfonso XI of Castile died of the plague in 1350 while besieging Gibraltar. The Byzantine Emperor John VI's son Andronikos died in the plague. The specific royal mortality was not as high as the population's general mortality, but it was significant, and it included the specific critical category of the heir. The young person who had not yet acquired the immunity of the older survivor, but who was the specific essential succession link without which the dynastic structure became unstable. The political disruption of the post-plague world was not primarily the disruption of the royal mortality. The monarchies had the specific dynastic resilience of the institution designed to survive the individual's death. It was the disruption of the specific underlying political economy that the monarchy depended on. The revenue, the military service, the administrative capacity, the social order that the feudal system provided, and that the Black Death had shaken at every level. The revenue crisis was the specific, immediate political consequence of the mortality, the specific dramatic reduction in the tax base that the loss of a third of the tax-paying population produced. The king, whose revenues depended on the specific feudal dues and the specific commercial taxes of the surviving population, found the surviving population was paying more taxes per person, but the total revenue was still substantially reduced from the pre-plague baseline because the total population was substantially reduced. The specific financial pressure on the post-plague monarchies was the financial pressure of the institution whose income had been reduced by the mortality, while many of its expenses, the military campaigns, the administrative apparatus, the specific diplomatic and ecclesiastical obligations of the medieval monarchy, had not declined in proportion. The 100 Years' War between England and France, the specific military conflict that the plague years interrupted and that the post-plague decades resumed, was the specific political context in which the English and French post-plague financial crises were experienced most acutely. The specific poll taxes that the English government imposed in the 1370s and 1380s, the specific fiscal devices that the peasants' revolt of 1381 was directly responding to, were the specific desperate fiscal measures of the government that had exhausted the conventional revenue sources and was reaching for the extraordinary taxation that the extraordinary military expenses required. The specific political innovation of the post-plague decades was the innovation of the representative institution, the parliament, the estates general, the courtiers, the diet, as the specific mechanism through which the post-plague monarchies attempted to expand the tax base beyond the traditional feudal revenue. The specific bargain of the representative institution, the consent to taxation in exchange for the specific legislative concessions that the assembly could extract from the monarch, was the specific political exchange that the financial crisis had made necessary and that the post-plague decades made standard. The English Parliament's specific expansion of its authority in the post-plague decades, the specific legislative and financial control that the Commons acquired over the period from the 1350s through the 1390s, was the specific constitutional consequence of the financial crisis that the mortality had created and that the military expenses had exacerbated. The Good Parliament of 1376, the specific English parliamentary session that impeached the king's ministers for corruption and that introduced the specific procedural innovation of impeachment into the English constitutional tradition was the specific post-plague political event that the changed conditions of the period had made possible. The Italian city-states were the specific political environment in which the post-plague political transformation was most concentrated and most innovative, the specific institutional response of the Italian cities to the mortality, the public health infrastructure, the lazaretto, the plague doctor, the formal quarantine regulation, was the specific administrative innovation that the emergency had produced, and that the Italian city's specific commercial and political sophistication had organized into the formal institutions that the subsequent centuries would build on. The plague doctor, the specific figure of the masked physician in the long protective coat, and the beak-shaped mask filled with aromatic herbs, the specific visual image of the Italian public health response, was the specific institutional innovation of the Venetian public health system that had developed the specific professional figure of the employed physician whose specific contractual obligation was the attendance on plague patients, regardless of the personal risk. The beak mask was not effective protection against the plague. The aromatic herbs in the beak were not protection against the flea that transmitted the disease. But the long coat and the gloves were the specific partial protection against the flea contact that the specific mechanism of the transmission would eventually explain. The political legitimacy of the post-plague rulers was the political legitimacy of the institution that had failed to prevent the catastrophe and was now required to manage its aftermath. The specific political challenge of the post-plague monarch was the challenge of the ruler whose authority had been challenged, not overthrown, but shaken by the specific demonstration that the divine protection that the anointed monarch was supposed to provide had not been provided, that the specific plague had killed the Lord alongside the peasant with the same democratic thoroughness that the danse macabre was depicting in the art. The response to this challenge was the specific political theater of the intensified royal display, the specific elaborate court ceremonial of the post-plague monarchies, the specific ostentatious magnificence of the court that the monarchy used to reassert the specific divine authorization that the mortality had called into question, the specific elaborate court culture of the late 14th and 15th centuries, the specific extraordinary luxury of the Burgundian court, the specific theatrical kingship of Richard II of England, the specific magnificent patronage of the Italian signori, was the political response to the challenge of the plague's democratic mortality, the reassertion of the specific hierarchical distinction that the danse macabre had threatened to dissolve. Chapter 13, The Long Recovery. Why Europe took 250 years to return to pre-plague population and what happened in between. The recovery was not recovery, not in the simple sense of the numerical return to the pre-plague population, which, as we noted, did not occur in England until approximately 1600, but in the deeper sense of the restoration of the pre-plague world, the specific medieval world of the 14th century that the plague had disrupted, which did not happen because the world that returned was not the world that had existed before. The recovery was the construction of something new on the ruins of the old, not the restoration of the old itself. The demographic recovery was interrupted by the specific recurrences that the plague's endemic presence in the European reservoir produced through the 14th and 15th centuries. The 1361 recurrence, the 1369 epidemic, the 1374 to 79 epidemic, the various regional outbreaks that the plague maintained its presence through. Each of these interrupted the recovery cycle, removing from the population the specific new births that would have begun to restore the pre-plague numbers, and preventing the demographic recovery from reaching the sustained momentum that the uninterrupted reproduction would have allowed. The specific demographic trajectory of the English population through the post-plague period illustrates the recovery's complexity. In 1300, England had approximately 6 million people. By 1353, it had approximately 3.5 million. By 1400, it had approximately 2.5 million, lower than 1353, the specific result of the recurrences having continued to reduce the population that the recovery had been partially rebuilding. The nadir of the English population occurred not in the immediate aftermath of the first wave, but approximately 50 years later, when the accumulated mortality of the recurrences and the reduced birth rates of the depleted population had continued the reduction that the first wave had begun. The economic structures of the long recovery period were not the economic structures of the pre-plague world, because the specific transformed conditions of the labor market, the land market, and the commercial economy had produced the specific new economic institutions that the changed conditions required. The enclosure, the cash wage economy, the commutation of the labor service obligations, the expanded luxury market, the new trading relationships that the disrupted trade routes had reorganized. These were the specific economic institutions of the post-plague world, not the restored institutions of the pre-plague world. The Black Death was not the cause of the Renaissance. This requires stating because the connection is sometimes made in the specific reductive way that assigns the complex intellectual and cultural transformation of the 15th and 16th centuries to the specific social disruption of the 14th century. The Renaissance had multiple causes, deep roots in the Italian humanist tradition that preceded the plague, and the specific intellectual energies of the 15th century that cannot be explained by the 14th century's mortality alone. But the plague was a contributing condition to the specific Renaissance transformation. Not the cause, but the context, the specific disruption of the medieval world's specific stable institutions that the Renaissance's new thinking required to be stable in order to resist. The specific authority of the Galenic medical tradition that the plague had demonstrated to be inadequate was the specific intellectual authority that the Renaissance medical humanism found most worth challenging. The specific authority of the scholastic philosophical tradition that the plague had failed to explain was the specific intellectual authority that the Renaissance Platonism found most worth replacing. The specific Italian context of the early Renaissance was the context of the post-plague Italian cities, the Florence and Venice and Milan, that had been the most devastated of the European cities, and that were the most commercially sophisticated and the most culturally ambitious in the recovery. The specific Florentine patronage culture that produced Brunelleschi and Donatello and Ghiberti in the early 15th century was the patronage culture of the city that had lost 60% of its population and that was rebuilding its civic identity through the specific cultural investment in the artistic program that expressed the recovered city's claim to civilization. The Black Death's specific intellectual legacy was the legacy of the question that it had raised and not answered, the question of the relationship between the divine will and the human suffering, between the specific moral order that the medieval world had assumed and the specific democratic mortality that the plague had demonstrated. This question, unanswered by the Church's penitential theology, unanswered by the flagellant's self-punishment, unanswered by the scapegoating of the Jewish community, was the specific intellectual inheritance of the post-plague world that the subsequent centuries of European thought worked through in the specific various forms of the Renaissance humanism and the Protestant Reformation and the scientific revolution that the question demanded. Chapter 14. The Knowledge. How the Black Death changed what Europeans knew and how they knew it. The autopsy changed everything. Not in 1348. The immediate chaos of the first wave did not produce the specific, calm, institutional response of the systematic medical investigation. But in the decades following the first wave, in the specific Italian cities, where the public health infrastructure had developed, and where the intellectual tradition of the universities was engaging with the catastrophe's challenge, the autopsy, the systematic post-mortem examination of the plague victim's body, became the specific, investigative response of the institution attempting to understand the disease through the direct examination of what the disease had done to the body. The autopsy tradition in European medicine predated the plague. The dissection had been practiced in the Italian medical schools since the early 14th century, in the specific limited form that the Church's specific discomfort with a systematic violation of the human corpse had permitted in theory, if not always in practice. The plague expanded the autopsy tradition in the specific way of the catastrophe that created the specific, urgent demand for the understanding that the direct examination of the body could provide and that the textual tradition had failed to provide. The specific anatomical knowledge that the post-plague autopsies produced was the knowledge of the plague's specific pathological signature. The buboes, the hemorrhagic spots, the specific internal findings that the examination of the plague-killed body revealed. This knowledge was not the knowledge of the disease's mechanism. The specific bacteriological understanding of Yersinia pestis was 6 centuries in the future, but it was the specific clinical knowledge of the disease's appearance that the systematic observation of the open body produced. The specific observational tradition of the post-plague medical investigation, the turn from the textual authority to the direct observation as the primary source of medical knowledge, was the specific epistemological shift that the plague had forced on the medical tradition. The physician who had watched the Galenic treatment fail in the plague wards and who had conducted the autopsies on the plague's victims was the physician who had the specific experiential data that the textual tradition could not provide and that the subsequent medical development required. The vernacular literature of the post-plague period was the specific knowledge tradition that the crisis of the clerical mediation had energized. The tradition of writing in the language of the people rather than the language of the scholar. The specific post-plague expansion of writing in English and Italian and French and the other vernacular languages of Europe was a specific cultural response to the crisis of the clerical monopoly on the sacred text and the intellectual tradition that the plague had made visible. Boccaccio's Decameron was written in Italian, not Latin. The Lollard Bible was translated into English. The mystical tradition of Julian of Norwich was recorded in English. The peasants' revolt's demands were articulated in English. The specific vernacular turn of the post-plague intellectual tradition was the turn toward the language of the people who had survived the catastrophe and who needed the specific accessible form of the knowledge that the catastrophe had made urgent. The printing press, Gutenberg's innovation of the 1450s, was the specific technological amplification of the vernacular tradition that the post-plague decades had energized. The specific mass production of the text in the vernacular language that the printing press enabled was the specific technological infrastructure that the post-plague intellectual tradition had been preparing for by establishing the demand for the vernacular text that the press would eventually supply. The astrology was the specific intellectual tradition that the plague had simultaneously embarrassed and energized. Embarrassed by its failure to predict or explain the catastrophe in the specific practical terms that the population required, and energized by the specific, increased demand for the explanation and the prediction that the catastrophe had produced. The Paris medical faculty's attribution of the plague to the planetary conjunction was the specific institutional deployment of the astrological tradition in the context of the medical emergency. And the failure of this attribution to produce useful guidance did not eliminate the tradition so much as it added the specific plague-related material to the astrological literature that the subsequent centuries continued to develop. The specific intellectual tradition of the later 14th century that most directly engaged with the epistemological questions that the plague had raised was the tradition of the nominalist philosophy. The specific philosophical movement associated primarily with William of Ockham and the Oxford School that had developed before the plague, but whose specific intellectual implications, the limitations of the human reason's capacity to know the divine, the specific separation between the theological truth and the philosophical truth, were given the specific urgency of the catastrophe's challenge to both. Occam's razor, the specific methodological principle that entities should not be multiplied beyond necessity, was the intellectual instrument of the nominalist tradition's challenge to the elaborate philosophical constructions of the scholastic theology. And the plague's specific demonstration of the elaborate explanations, failure to provide useful guidance, gave the principle of parsimony the specific, practical weight that the academic context alone had not provided. Chapter 15. The World Beyond Europe. How the Black Death affected the rest of the connected world. The plague was not European. The specific common presentation of the Black Death as the catastrophe of medieval Europe obscures the specific global scale of the mortality that the connected world of the 14th century produced. The plague that arrived in the Crimea in 1346 and reached Sicily in 1347 had come from the Central Asian steppes, from the specific reservoir population of the marmots and the other rodents of the steppe that the plague's bacterium maintained as its permanent host between the outbreaks in the human population. The Mongol Empire. The specific political and commercial infrastructure that had connected the world from China to the Black Sea in the 13th and 14th centuries was the specific transmission mechanism that moved the plague from its Central Asian reservoir to the connected ports of the Black Sea trade, and from there into the Mediterranean and the European commercial network. The Pax Mongolica, the specific peace that the Mongol dominance of the Eurasian steppe had produced, and that had facilitated the unprecedented expansion of the overland trade between China and Europe, was the specific commercial condition that made the plague's transmission possible at the speed and the scale that the 1340s epidemic demonstrated. China was hit first and hit catastrophically. The specific Chinese mortality of the mid-14th century, the epidemic that devastated the population of China in the 1330s and 1340s before the plague reached the Black Sea, was the specific mortality that the Chinese historical records document in the specific demographic terms of the population that declined from approximately 125 million in 1200 to approximately 65 million by 1393. The Chinese mortality was comparable to the European mortality in proportion and exceeded it in absolute terms. The specific political consequence of the Chinese mortality was the specific political transformation of the Yuan dynasty, the Mongol dynasty that had ruled China since Kublai Khan's conquest, and that the plague had weakened in the specific way of the institution whose administrative capacity was reduced by the mortality it could not prevent. The Red Turban Rebellion of the 1350s, the specific Chinese peasant uprising that the plague's disruption had energized in the specific way that the European peasant uprisings had been energized, was the specific political consequence that the Chinese mortality produced, and the specific outcome of the Red Turban Rebellion was the end of the Yuan dynasty and the founding of the Ming dynasty in 1368. The Ming dynasty's specific political response to the catastrophe of the plague and the Mongol rule, the turning inward, the specific withdrawal from the maritime expansion that the early Ming period had produced in the extraordinary voyages of Zheng He. The specific decision to reduce the engagement with the connected world that the Mongol infrastructure had opened was one of the most consequential political decisions of the 15th century. The specific withdrawal of Chinese maritime power from the Indian Ocean and the Pacific in the 1430s was the specific decision that the plague's transformation of the Chinese political order had produced, and its specific consequence was the specific space that the European maritime expansion filled in the second half of the 15th century. The Islamic world was also devastated. The specific mortality of the Middle East and North Africa, the territories of the Mamluk Sultanate, the Ilkhanate, the various smaller Islamic polities, was the mortality of the specific connected trade world that the Islamic commercial networks maintained, and that the plague had traversed in its spread from the Central Asian reservoir to the Mediterranean ports. Egypt's population declined by approximately 40% in the first wave. Syria, Iraq, and Persia were hit similarly. The specific intellectual and theological response of the Islamic world to the Black Death is documented in the works of Ibn Khaldun, the specific 14th century Islamic historian and sociologist whose Muqaddimah is one of the most extraordinary works of historical analysis produced by any civilization in any period, and whose specific engagement with the Black Death's demographic and social consequences produced the first systematic sociological analysis of how societies respond to catastrophic mortality. Ibn Khaldun, who was born in 1332 in Tunis and who lived through the Black Death's first wave as a child, losing both his parents to the epidemic, wrote in the Muqaddimah's preface that the plague had devastated nations and caused populations to vanish, and that civilization decreased with the decrease of mankind. His specific analytical engagement with the plague's demographic consequences, the reduction of the cultivated land, the collapse of the craft industries, the specific economic and political consequences of the population decline, was the specific intellectual achievement of the observer who had experienced the catastrophe and had the specific analytical framework to understand its systemic implications. Chapter 16. The Language. How the Black Death changed what words existed and what words meant. The English language lost half its speakers in 4 years. This is not a metaphor, and it is not an exaggeration. The specific demographic catastrophe of the first plague wave reduced the population of England from approximately 5 to 6 million to approximately 3 to 3.5 million. And the specific population that had been reduced was the population that spoke English, Middle English, the specific various dialectally fragmented English of the 14th century that was simultaneously the language of the Chaucer, who was beginning his literary career, and the language of the plowman, who could not read Chaucer and did not know Chaucer existed, but who spoke the same language in the specific local form of the Essex or the Yorkshire or the Northumbrian dialect that the region had maintained. The consequence of losing half the speakers of a language in 4 years is the consequence that the linguist who studies language change finds genuinely interesting, and that the living person who experienced it found genuinely catastrophic. The specific disruption of the transmission of the linguistic tradition that the mortality had produced. The language is transmitted, person to person, generation to generation, through the specific daily interaction of the speakers who maintain the community of the language use. Remove half the speakers and the transmission is disrupted in the specific ways that the disrupted transmission always disrupts. The vocabulary that the dead carried and did not transmit, the specific dialectal forms that the concentrated mortality in particular villages and particular communities had eliminated from the surviving population, the specific technical vocabularies of the crafts and the trades and the occupations that the mortality had reduced. The technical vocabulary of the dead was the specific linguistic loss that the post-plague period documented in the particular form of the occupational terms that the depleted trades had lost, and that the surviving population was replacing with whatever vocabulary the reorganized industry required. The specific craft terminology of the woolen industry, the specific technical words for the stages of the wool production, the specific instruments and the specific processes of the medieval textile trade, was the vocabulary that the mortality had disrupted in the specific way of the industry, whose practitioners had died, and whose successor generation was learning the trade from the diminished pool of the surviving masters. The Latin was dying faster than the vernacular, in the specific way of the language, whose transmission was entirely dependent on the clerical and academic institutions that the mortality had devastated. The specific quality crisis of the post-plague clergy, the rapid ordination of underqualified replacements that the episcopal administration had been forced to accept, was the quality crisis of the Latin transmitters, the specific weakening of the link in the transmission chain that the clerical institution represented. The priest, who could barely read Latin, was the priest who was transmitting the Latin tradition with the specific reduced competence of the inadequately trained, and the specific cumulative effect of the inadequate transmission across the post-plague decades was the specific deterioration of the Latin standard that the reforming humanists of the 15th century would identify as the target of their restoration project. The vernacular was rising as the Latin was declining, in the specific inverse relationship that the post-plague disruption of the clerical monopoly on literacy had produced. The person who could read and write in the post-plague world was increasingly the person who read and wrote in the vernacular rather than the Latin, not because the Latin had ceased to be the prestige language of the intellectual tradition, but because the specific practical need for the written communication in the specific transactional contexts of the post-plague economy was the need for the written word in the language that the transacting parties actually spoke. The specific expansion of English literacy in the post-plague decades, the expansion of the capacity to read and write in English that the changed economic and social conditions of the period promoted, was the specific linguistic consequence of the social mobility that the labor market had produced. The peasant who had moved from the bound serf's position to the cash wage laborer's position, who was now engaging in the commercial transactions of the market economy, needed the specific literacy skills of the commercial person. the ability to read the contract, to write the receipt, to understand the legal document in the specific vernacular form that the transaction was conducted in. The legal language was the specific contested domain of the post-plague linguistic transformation, the specific legal terminology of the medieval English court system that was conducted primarily in law French, the specific Norman French of the legal tradition that had been the language of the English courts since the conquest, and that the post-plague decades were beginning to see challenged by the English that the rising commercial class was more comfortable in. The Statute of Pleading of 1362, the specific English parliamentary legislation that mandated the use of English rather than French in the oral pleadings of the English courts, was the specific legislative expression of the post-plague linguistic shift in the domain, where the shift had the most concrete institutional significance. The plague vocabulary was the specific new vocabulary that the mortality had added to the European languages, the specific words and phrases that the catastrophe's experience had produced, and that the post-plague languages needed to accommodate. The quarantine, from the Italian quarantino, the 40-day isolation, was the specific technical vocabulary of the Italian public health response that the European languages borrowed as they borrowed the institution. The lazaretto, the specific plague hospital that the Italian cities had established, was the specific Italian institution whose name the European languages adopted alongside the institution itself. The pest house, the plague doctor, the bill of mortality. The specific institutional vocabulary of the plague management that the post-plague public health administration had developed was the specific vocabulary addition that the mortality had made to the languages of the people who managed the recurrent epidemic. The poetry of death was the specific literary vocabulary that the post-plague tradition had expanded in the specific dimension of the mortality's linguistic engagement, the specific words and images and literary forms for the encounter with death that the art and the literature of the post-plague decades had developed. The transi, the danse macabre, the memento mori, the ars moriendi, the specific vocabulary of the post-plague mortality culture was the vocabulary that the literary tradition of the subsequent centuries would inherit and deploy in the specific contexts that the continuing engagement with mortality required. The survivor's language was the specific compressed language of the people who had shared an experience so profound that the experience itself had become the reference point. The specific conversational compression of the community that had been through something together and that could reference it with the specific shorthand of the shared experience without the explanation that the outsider required. The specific linguistic markers of the post-plague generation, the specific ways of referring to the mortality, the specific vocabulary of the survival and the loss and the changed world, are preserved in the documents and the literature of the period as the specific linguistic evidence of the specific shared experience that the catastrophe had produced. The word plague itself was transformed by the Black Death from the general term for any epidemic disease to the specific, named catastrophe, whose specific horrors the word evoked for the generations that had experienced them. The specific semantic loading of the word, the specific emotional weight that the post-plague generations attached to it, was the linguistic consequence of the specific experience that had given the word its irreversible association with the worst thing that had ever happened to the living memory of the European population. The demographic shift had the specific linguistic consequence of the dialect consolidation that the mortality's uneven distribution across the linguistic landscape had produced. the specific English dialects that the pre-plague period had maintained in the specific local forms of the various regional communities were subjected to the specific mixing that the post-plague labor mobility had produced. The workers who moved between the manors and the towns and the regions in the specific economic reorganization that the labor shortage had promoted were the workers who carried their specific dialectal forms with them and who encountered the specific dialectal forms of the communities they moved through and into. The specific dialect mixing of the post-plague labor mobility was the specific linguistic process that the history of English dialectal development identifies as one of the contributing factors in the gradual movement toward the more standardized forms that the 15th and 16th centuries would produce. Not a simple linear standardization. The regional dialects of English maintained their specific local forms through the medieval and early modern period, but the specific mixing and contact that the labor mobility promoted was the specific early stage of the longer process of the dialectal convergence that the printing press would eventually accelerate. Chaucer was the specific literary figure who captures the post-plague linguistic situation most completely. The poet who wrote in English in the specific Central Midlands dialect that the London commercial environment had established as the prestige vernacular form, who drew on the specific linguistic resources of the French and the Latin and the Italian traditions that the medieval educated person had access to, and who produced the specific English literature that the subsequent centuries identified as the foundational moment of the English literary tradition. The Canterbury Tales' specific linguistic variety, the different registers and the different dialects, and the different vocabularies that the different tales deploy, is the specific linguistic portrait of the post-plague English world in its extraordinary compressed diversity. The knight's formal, elevated language, the miller's earthy, direct vernacular, the pardoner's slick commercial rhetoric, the wife of Bath's combative knowing tone. Each of these is the specific linguistic register of the specific social position that the post-plague world had produced, and together they are the specific literary evidence that the post-plague English language was not the flattened, uniform, disaster-simplified language of the depleted population, but the specific, rich, varied language of the society that the mortality had reorganized rather than destroyed. The language survived, not unchanged. The specific transmission disruptions and the specific dialect mixing and the specific vocabulary additions of the post-plague decades had changed it in ways that the historical linguist can document and analyze, but fundamentally recognizable, fundamentally continuous, fundamentally the same language that had existed before, the linguistic equivalent of the demographic recovery, the specific resilience of the human cultural system that the catastrophe had shaken but not broken. The words outlasted the mortality. They usually do. Conclusion. The world, the plague, made both. What the Black Death ultimately changed, and what it couldn't, it is 1400. You are in a different village than the one you were standing in at the beginning of the script. Not because the plague moved you, because 50 years of the post-plague transformation has moved everything. The village you are standing in now has more survivors per house than it did in 1353, because the houses are fewer and the families have consolidated. The wages are higher, the food is better, the priest speaks serviceable Latin. The Lord has agreed to take cash instead of labor service, which is still technically illegal under the statute of laborers, and which both parties are carefully not mentioning. The church is still there. But the painting on the wall above the door is a new painting, a dance of death, the skeleton leading the Pope and the Emperor and the peasant in the specific democratic procession that the post-plague artistic tradition has made ubiquitous. The painting was paid for by a merchant family who had the specific new wealth that the labor market and the land market had produced for them, and who wanted the specific religious investment of the wall painting to balance the account that the earthly prosperity was running up with the divine. Europe is recognizably different from the Europe of 1347. The feudal system is cracking, not broken, not ended, but cracking in ways that the people on both sides of the crack can feel. The church's authority is diminished, not abolished, not challenged to the breaking point, but diminished in ways that the Wycliffites and the Hussites are articulating, and that the subsequent centuries' reforming energy will amplify. The labor market has been permanently altered, not in the specific sense of permanent equality, because the lords and the parliaments and the sumptuary laws are all still resisting the equality that the arithmetic is pushing toward, but in the specific sense of the market, whose underlying structure has changed in ways that the legal resistance cannot entirely reverse. The art is extraordinary. The specific extraordinary art of the post-plague decades, the Transy tombs, the Danse Macabre, the Decameron, the Canterbury Tales, Julian of Norwich's Revelations, the specific, vivid, mortality-saturated art of the world that has been through the catastrophe and has found in the aftermath the specific, creative energy that the catastrophe's challenge produced, is the art of the world that has looked at death directly and has found, in the looking, the specific artistic vision that the comfortable world cannot produce. The medicine is slowly improving, not in the dramatic, paradigm-shifting way of the scientific revolution that is still 2 centuries away, but in the specific, incremental way of the tradition that the plague has forced into the autopsy room, and the observational record, and the quarantine station, and the public health regulation that represents the specific practical improvement that the catastrophe's challenge to the received tradition has produced. The world is smaller and larger simultaneously. Smaller because the mortality has reduced its human population by 1/4 or more. Larger because the specific disruption of the post-plague world has broken the specific, local isolation that the overcrowded pre-plague world had maintained. And the mobility of the labor market, and the reorganization of the trade routes, and the specific new political configurations of the post-plague decades have connected the surviving population in the specific, new ways that the pre-plague world's specific overloaded stability had not required. The Black Death did not end in 1353. It recurred in 1361 and in 1369, and in the various subsequent waves that punctuated the European experience through the 14th and 15th centuries, and into the early modern period. The last significant outbreak in England was in 1665, more than 3 centuries after the first wave. The specific endemic presence of the plague in the European and global reservoir was the specific ongoing condition of the post-plague world, the specific permanent alteration of the disease landscape that the 1347 outbreak had produced. But the world that the plague built, the specific transformed world of the post-plague Europe, with its changed labor markets, and its altered church, and its new art, and its slowly improving medicine, and its reconfigured social order, was the specific world that the Renaissance and the Reformation and the scientific revolution built on. Not because the plague caused these developments in any simple sense, but because the plague had broken the specific stable systems of the medieval world, the feudal economy, the clerical monopoly, the scholastic philosophy, the Galenic medicine, that the new developments required to be breakable. The survivors had asked the question that the catastrophe forced on them. Why did this happen? And what does it mean? And what do we do now? The answers they found in the art and the theology and the economics and the politics and the medicine and the philosophy of the post-plague decades were the specific beginning of the answers that the subsequent centuries refined and debated and built into the world that eventually produced the world we live in. The plague ended. The world it made continues. That specific continuing world is where you are standing now. All shall be well, Julian of Norwich said. All shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. She wrote it while the plague was still recurring, knowing it was still recurring, having processed the catastrophe's specific theological challenge through the specific intellectual and spiritual work that produced the most beautiful statement of hope in the English language. She was not wrong. It just took a while,